will you please help me in joining in welcoming Mark Rosewater to the stage? Let's have a huge round of applause.
My wife asked me to take a picture. So everybody cheer. Okay, let's have a talk. Okay, I got to hook in first. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I have a thing in my pocket I have to connect first. Sorry. The stimulating behind the scenes, I have a little thing I have to plug into first. The rest of the talk is more stimulating than that. Okay. Okay, let me know when you guys can see. Okay, hold on. Up there. Yay! Okay, well, welcome. Every MagicCon that I come to, I get to give a talk. I'm a big Magic historian. I like sharing about the history of the game. And so I'm going to do that today by talking about the 20 most influential expansions. My name is Mark Rosewater. I'm the head designer for Magic the Gathering. And on October 30th is my 30th anniversary. Okay, so today I'm talking about the 20 most influential expansions. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? Let me lay down some ground rules. This is all my opinion, my panel, my opinion. I'm the head designer, so I'm judging the sets based on the influence they had on future designs. Because I'm measuring influence, this scale gives extra weight towards innovation. But it's about more than just who did something first. What sets had the biggest impact in defining how we make Magic? This does mean more of the sets in the top 20 are older, as they've had more time to influence later Magic design. Okay, before we begin, this is called the 20 most influential expansions. Alpha's not an expansion, but I wanted to give, obviously Alpha had a huge influence on all of Magic. So as a nod to Alpha, it is not in the top 20 because it's not an expansion, but Alpha, obviously, if Richard had not made Alpha, none of this would have happened. So Alpha is super important, obviously. Okay, let's start with number 20, The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. This is actually the most recent set. There's not a lot, most of the sets are a little bit older. But this set really paved the way for what a Universes Beyond set was. The lead vision designer was Ben Hayes, and the lead set designer was Glenn Jones. For each of these, I'm going to talk about who led the set, because I care about things like that. So what made this set really stand out? Well, it really had a lot of flavorful top-down designs. It really sort of paved the way for what makes for a fun Universes Beyond set. We repurposed a lot of existing mechanics, food, amass, historic, land cycling. One of the things we learned that really makes Universes Beyond shine is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. What are the mechanics Magic has made over the last 32 years that makes for a fun Magic set? We use sagas. We discovered that Universes Beyond are very much about story. Sagas are about story. So there's and you'll see in future Universes Beyond, we've done a lot of cool different things, whether it's episodes in Doctor Who or comic runs and Spider-Man. We've really found ways to use sagas. And we did something really cool with the Nazgul. The idea of having 9 different images is a trick that went really well, that was very popular, that we're using elsewhere. And we did a lot with the experimental booster fun. This is the maps, the Middle-earth maps we used on the basic lands. We tried brand new frames, something that we did here. And we did the extended art, doing the scenes is something that we learned about here. We also did box toppers. And we did the serialized rings. Just a general idea of doing a serialized product started here. It didn't start here, but it really cemented how we would do it. And then we had a lot of different ways to do it. Different people could, there's ones that are harder to get but easier to get, and we did different layers of it. And hands down, my marketing people will tell you, it had the single best promotion we have ever done. And it went better than we could have possibly hoped. One of our worries was, like, somebody would open it 20 years from now, like be in their closet, you know. But luckily, somebody did find it, and obviously, you guys all know the story. So that is number 20, The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. Number 19, Unglued, in August of 1998. The lead designer was me. The lead developer was kind of me, but really it was nobody. I'm not sure how much development this set got. Okay, so Bill Rose and Joel Mick. So before I was head designer, Bill Rose was the head designer. He later became the VP of R&D. Before he was head designer, Joel Mick was the head designer. He later became the brand manager for Magic. So Bill and Joel came to me, and they said, we have an idea for a product. Actually, I put my glasses on so I can read this. He said, okay, the idea is it's a set that's not legal in tournaments. So I said, what can the cards do? And they said, absolutely anything. It won't be played in tournaments. So I said, why are you coming to me? And they said, you seem like the kind of designer that will have fun with it. And I said, oh, I will. This is me at the pre-release, dressed as a chicken. So I clearly had fun with it. Okay, first and foremost, full art lands premiered in Unglued. The story behind them was I was going on a trip to Gen Con many years ago, and seated next to me was Christopher Rush. You guys might know him better as the illustrator of Black Lotus, among many other Magic cards. He also created the mana symbols. He's a graphic designer. So Chris was telling me about an idea he had. He said, you know, normally on the land, you know, the art is contained, but why does it have to be? There's not a lot of information here. Couldn't we make it bigger? And so he pitched this idea at Wizards, and they just rejected it. They're like, why would people want more, bigger art? So he told me about it, and I said, well, I'm making the weird set. I'll put it in my set. And so we put the basic lands in the set. We obviously had 5 of them. We did 1 per pack, and they went over really, really well. So much so that obviously now 4 lands are just a staple, something we do all the time. We've even got pretty inventive with them, and it's just something Magic does. And the only reason it existed was because the silly product, no one stopped me from doing it, and then really showed how much all of you enjoyed it. So thank you, Chris Rush. Also, token cards. Token cards premiered in this product. They did not exist before this. So where did token cards come from? Well, it's a story about magic, but not that kind of magic. This kind of magic. And it starts with a young boy who used to do children's parties. That is me. I was called the Whiz Kid. That was my name. And I used to do actual magic in my youth. The Gathering didn't exist yet, so I was forced to do magic. Anyway, I used to do card tricks. And there was one deck of cards that was really cool that just had weird cards. It had like the 15 of hearts or the 4.5 of clubs. And the idea was they were just weird cards, and you, the magician, figure out what you wanted to do with them. There wasn't necessarily a trick. It was just these weird cards that did things. And I was really enamored by this product. So when I was making Unglued, I'm like, okay, that's what I want this product to be. I just want to put things in it that are different and weird, and that let's change what's in a Magic booster. So when I was in Grand Prix Tokyo in May of 1997, which was the very first Grand Prix Tokyo, I noticed somebody playing a Verdant Force, and he was using tokens from another game. I won't mention which game. And I realized that there was something cool, like he was representing the token in the game. Normally you use glass beads or dice. So I came up with the idea of, well, what if we just put that in a booster pack? What if just there was a card, and early on my philosophy was, what is it? Well, what size is it? What abilities does it have? I didn't tell you. I didn't put anything on that because none of them existed. I'm like, well, I want you to use this for as many things as possible. And so obviously over the years, these have evolved and have become a staple. They're now something that shows up not just in every booster pack, but so much so that we design around them. Tokens are a big tool in our tool belt. So it's something that R&D uses all the time. And a lot of that is because of the token cards, which only exist because they first showed up in Unglued. And token cards, obviously, just to become, we've had a lot of fun with them. There's a lot of cool token cards. Alternate frames. So one of the things we did in Unglued was we said, why does it have to look like a normal Magic card? So often it didn't. And we turned them sideways and had art that went over multiple cards. And, Spike Fiend, I shrunk the size of the art box so I could have a giant text box. And alternate frames, once again, have become just part of Magic. And little by little, they've slowly grown over time. But now they've become a pretty big part of when we make a Magic set, we say, oh, do we want alternate frames? It's something we think about all the time. Also, it was the first set ever to break frames, something that later would go on to be a planeswalker thing. It's the first set to have watermarks, obviously something we would use a lot more. And first set with die rolling. And a lot of the early versions of cards would later turn into actual cards. We make them into cards, often with a new name. And there was a lot of mechanical exploration. Infernal Spawn of Evil turned into Forecast, the mechanic from Dissension. The seals came from here. The idea of team mechanics first showed up here. And the BFM was the inspiration for Meld. So a lot of things we did here later got done in a little more normal way in normal sets. So that's why number 19 is Unglued. Number 18, Tempest. So by the way, I show up a lot in the designers of these. But before we get there, this is Mike Davis. I don't know how many of you know who Mike Davis is. He was a friend of Richard Garfield's. So Richard Garfield invented a game, not that one, Robo Rally. And Richard was interested. Richard loved inventing. He wasn't really interested in selling. So Richard just went and designed more games. But Mike thought that Robo Rally was a really cool game. So he said to Richard, because I tried to sell it. And Richard goes, fine. If you can sell it, I'll split it with you. And so Mike Davis went to Washington and set up a meeting with a man named Peter Atkinson. He dragged Richard along at a small company, a small role-playing company called Wizards of the Coast. You know where the story goes. So anyway, Mike Davis later became the vice president of R&D. And he had a run-in with someone you might recognize who's a little bit younger in this photo. It was me. So I used to do some freelancing. I wrote for The Duelist. I wrote for a bunch of different products. At one point, I actually was freelancing for 7 different sections of the company. So I used to visit up in Renton from time to time. And one day, I said to him, I'd be willing to move to Seattle. And he said, well, when could you start? I'm like, how about October? October 30th, it turned out. It's always been a dream of mine to be a game designer. And he goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not hiring you as a game designer. We're hiring you as a game developer. Is that okay? And I said, sure. Here's the thing. It wasn't. But I got my foot in the door, and so early Magics, I was the developer. I did develop, at one point there was 4 of us that did all the development, and I was the developer. But I used to play games after hours in R&D, and I would play with Richard Garfield, who there's no person on the planet who loves games more than Richard Garfield. We used to play games he would import from other places like Germany, and the rules were in German, so he'd have to teach us the game, and we just assumed he taught it correctly. So I know the game is Siedler de Catan, not Settlers of Catan, for example. So anyway, one day we're playing, and Richard says to me, I haven't done Magic design since Arabian Nights. It might be fun to work on a Magic design again. To which I say, so if I led a Magic design team, would you be on it? He goes, yeah, absolutely, that would be fun. So I go to Joel Mick, who was the head designer at the time, and I say, look, I know we're starting to look to do designs internally. I'm interested in leading a design team. And Richard said he'd be on it. And Joel said, well, if Richard would be on it. So the lead designer of Tempest was me. This was my first lead. And Henry Stern was the developer. Henry Stern was the very first person we hired off the Pro Tour. It would take us a couple years before we hired our second. OK, so this set told a story in the cards. And I don't just mean a little story. I mean a long story. We actually mapped it out. There's a storyboard. This is online if you ever want to see it. But there was a major, major story. The Weatherlight Saga was created by me and a man named Michael Ryan. And it was a very elaborate story, and we were very excited of telling as much of the story as we could in the cards. In fact, you didn't get a rule book. if you got the starter deck, you got a storybook that told you the story. So this was the first set that had any real world building. Mark Tadine, Anson Maddox, we got our first real world building team, and they built the world. In fact, there's a book called The Art of Magic that shows all the world building, the creature building, the character stuff, a lot of time and energy. And this became what Magic did. By the time, we had never done that before. Oops. It also had the first kicker mechanic, not kicker, buyback. Kicker would come later. So buyback let you get spells back if you paid extra mana. It had slivers for the very first time, which would go on to be a very popular creature type. Who would like to see more slivers? Slivers obviously have become a staple. They've showed up in a lot of different places, a fan favorite. And there's a lot of staple effects that showed up for the first time. Effects like in R&D, the lingo for the effect is the cards that showed up first time in Tempest. It also had the first teaser card. And what I mean by that is we tease something that we would then pay off in the next set. So this was a little tiny spike, but the real spikes, all the rest of the spikes, were in Stronghold, the next set. It had the first pre-constructed decks, and it had the first pre-release card. Why it was Dirtcall Worm, I have no idea. But it was the first pre-release card. Okay, so that's number 18, Tempest. Number 17, Mirrodin, October 2003. I was the lead designer. The lead developer was Randy Buehler. Okay, so I'm going to tell a little story. So when Magic began, Richard Garfield created a multiverse that he originally called Dominia, and then he invented a home plane he called Dominaria. That was very confusing. So we don't really call it Dominion anymore. But so the very first set took place in Dominaria. The second place actually didn't take place in Dominaria, but we didn't really know that. We didn't even give it a name until a year or two later. But then after that, a lot of sets took place in Dominaria. Now, Homelands did not. It actually went to Agrotha, so that was a different place. But then we came back, Dominaria, Dominaria, Dominaria. Then Michael Ryan and I made the Weatherlight Saga. We're like, let's get out of Dominaria. So we go to Wrath for a while. But then Michael and I got kicked off the team, so we went back to Dominaria. We're in Dominaria for a while. And then they had to finish with the story that Michael and I started. So they went to Mercadia for one set, to Wrath for one set, then back to Dominaria. Dominaria, 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 Dominaria. So we finally get to Mirrodin that I was in charge of. And I said, let's get out of Dominaria. Could we please go anywhere else? So I'm like, okay, let's go to a new plane. And this, when we talk about the world building, one of the cool things was we really integrated for the first time. It wasn't just that we were doing a world. We were doing a world that matched the mechanical theme. It was an artifact set, so we made a world where the creatures had a reason that they had metal in them, and that we made a whole world that makes sense. The set also had some revolutionary mechanics. Well, let's talk about them. We'll start with Affinity. So Affinity was what we call a cost reduction mechanic. It allowed the creatures to get cheaper. It spawned a lot of other mechanics, like we do a lot of cost reduction mechanics now, offering Delve, Emerge, Harmonize, and others. And what we learned is Affinity was just so useful. Now, we didn't always write the words Affinity on it, but we realized we could do it with creature types, subtypes. We could do it with individual creature types. We did a lot of creature types. And just random things we could do it with. The idea of cost reduction just became a de facto thing we do, and Affinity even became deciduous. We use Affinity now. It shows up from time to time on single cards. Entwine. So Entwine was the first time we had a mechanic where you chose multiple things, not one thing. Mirage introduced Charms, for example, where you chose one thing. But this is you chose multiple things, and that has become another thing that we use a lot. The set introduced Equipment. And it instantly became evergreen. As soon as we were done with that block, they just showed up in other sets. And Equipment obviously going on to be a pretty big part of Magic. It also had Imprint. The name Imprint we don't use as much, but the idea of exiling cards and those cards having a definitional meaning is something we do a lot. So all the mechanics in the set really went on to be influential. Oh, the other piece of trivia, by the way, is all four of the mechanics in that set were named in design and stayed to print. That doesn't happen very often. Okay, number 17, Mirrodin. Number 16, Magic 2010. July 2009. The lead designer is Aaron Forsyth, who's now my boss. The lead developer is Eric Lauer. Okay, so Alpha, way back in 1993, had 290 new cards. Beta had 2 new cards. For those that don't know, we left 2 of them out in Alpha. We had to put them in. Okay, Unlimited, Revise, 4th edition, 5th edition, no new cards. 6th edition, 7th edition, 8th edition, 9th edition, 10th edition, no new cards. Magic 2010, 158 new cards. So there's a pretty big gap, right? We obviously Alpha had new cards because it was the first time the game thing, but why all of a sudden did the core set have new cards? The answer is this. Oh, is that not clear enough? Here, I'll help you. Is that okay? Well, let me explain. In July of 2005, we made Russian for the first time. We put out a Russian set. And so the way that Magic worked, for those that may not realize from back in the day, is whenever we would do a limited edition, we would put a black border on it. Alpha and Beta are considered they're both considered limited edition. But once we got to an unlimited edition, which was a limited, it had a white border. And from then on, all of the sets, the core sets, had a white border. And the idea was, when we reprint something in a core set, it gets a white border. But then, when we printed Magic, because it's the first time it showed up in the market, by our rules, it had a black border. And it was very popular. And so, when they were making 10th edition, they said, I have a really good idea. Let's do exactly what they did in Russia, and they put a black border. So starting with 10th edition, core sets no longer had white borders, they had black borders. The problem was the next year's set was 2010. And the answer is, well, what do we do? How do we top black borders? Black borders is pretty exciting, and they weren't sure what to do. Now, in the office, we have what we call beta sheets. So the way you print Magic is they print it on a sheet that's either 10 by 10 or 11 by 11. They vary in size. And then the left is the common, middle is uncommon, right is a rare sheet. So they print it and they chop it up. That's how you make Magic cards. So we have a beta sheet in the office that hangs on the wall. So Aaron would go look at that. In his mind, he's like, how could I make Alpha 2.0? You know, he really wanted to reinvent the core set. So the first thing he said is, why can't we do new designs? What's this rule that we have to repeat everything? And it turns out that when all you have to choose is reprints, it really restricts what you can do. Sometimes you need a card that we just haven't made that card before. So Aaron's like, that's crazy. If you need a new design, make a new design. And while this might seem like an obvious idea, it was pretty revolutionary. That at the time, if you weren't a premier set, you really didn't make new cards. And especially with reprint products, they did not make new cards. He also was a big fan of resonance, saying, you know, what makes cards shine is really having things that match. And so a lot of the set, like you see Gin of Wishes on here, we're going to do a genie from, you know, like Aladdin's lamp. Okay, what would that do? And we do top-down designs to design it. Also introduced a lot of new terminology. It changed terminology, battlefield, exile, a lot of the terminology came from here. And there are a whole bunch of rules changes. Combat damage, no longer using the stack was the biggest one. So this was the first core set with mythic rares, the first core set with planeswalkers, the first core set with a pre-release, and Aaron wanted me to point out it brought back Lightning Bolt to standard. So that was number 16, Magic 2010. Number 15, alliances in June of 1996. So the lead designer was Scaff Elias, and the lead developer was Charlie Catino. So Charlie is famous, by the way, if you don't know this. His name is always misspelled, but always misspelled differently. So his name is Catino, which you might not know because he's never referred to as Catino in the rulebooks. Okay, so these are the East Coast playtesters. Chris Page, Dave Petty, Scaff Elias, and Jim Lynn. Anybody who listens to my podcast, I talk about them all the time. These were, when Richard first started making Magic, he was at the University of Pennsylvania. He befriended some people there, and those people ended up being called the East Coast playtesters. They were the people that playtested with him. He had a bunch of playtest groups. They're best known for making a set with the code name Ice Age. You can crack what set it became. Okay, so one of the biggest things it did, probably the loudest thing it did, is it did alternate cost cards. And what I meant by that is you didn't have to pay the mana cost in the upper right-hand corner. Now, these were pitch cards, meaning you had to pitch another card. A few of them you had to pay life in addition to that. In fact, Force of Will, I did a talk a couple MagicCons ago about the most influential individual card designs. Number 6 was Force of Will. And in that, I talked about how Chris Page of the East Coast Playtesters was one of my editors for the puzzles. And I used to tap out the opponent so that they couldn't do anything so I could just do the puzzle. And it gave him an idea, well, what if you could do something while you were tapped out? Now, this leads to a fun story. I've told the story before. I'll do the shortened version of it, but it's one of my favorite Magic stories. So when Alliances came out, it was the longest gap of time that Magic had ever gone without an expansion. 8 months, which is hard to believe now, but 8 months went by without a Magic expansion. And the customer service is the best picture I got of the customer service. The customer service people went to Peter Atkinson, and they thought the pitch cards were so wrong, were so like Magic, something that Magic just should not do, that they convinced Peter that he should pull back on the order. So he cut it in half. They cut the print to half. So then R&D talked. We sent Scaff to go discuss with Peter. And so what we basically did is we said, OK, R&D will pay for the other half of the printing, and we'll split the profit with you 50-50. That you have no risk to you. And then Peter heard that, and he put it back to 100. So we could have made a lot of money, but we didn't. OK, so alternate costs obviously have become a staple. Not just pitch cards, but just there's lots and lots of ways that you can now do things without paying the mana costs. This was the first set to be part of a block. In fact, the first set, Alliances got made, not Alliances, sorry. Ice Age got made, then was Homelands. And then this was sold as another set in the Alliances block. And it had some snow-covered. Now, this, by the way, this set wasn't designed to be the Ice Age expansion. It got made into the Ice Age expansion development. That's why there's not a lot of pieces in it that do that. There also is a lot of experimentation. The one thing I like about the East Coast Playtesters is they really, really like pushing boundaries. So this is the first sort of spell creature that was basically a creature, but it was an instant or sorcery. There was Vacation Town that made a whole bunch of creatures. The first temporary token. The first token was a secondary function. The first one to give tokens to the opponent. Lots of tokens. As far as auras, aura that can bounce itself, an aura that you can move to another creature, an aura whose effect varies based on what it goes on, an enchanted creature returns to the graveyard when they die. We also had additional mana costs that would lead to kicker ideas. Discard as an additional cost. Library as a resource where you'd spend cards in your library. And death trigger costs. All things that hadn't happened before. Oh, there's more. Destroy 4 or greater. Modal spell or creature. Modal of opponent's choice. And dividing up the cards into piles. All things that Alliances did first. So number 15, Alliances. Number 14, Antiquities in March of 1994. So this was also led by the East Coast Playtesters, and I'll say developed by the East Coast Playtesters. This is before we had development. And they kind of worked together, so I'm naming them all. Once again, East Coast Playtesters. So Alpha came out in 1993. It was printed, they printed a 1-year supply, and they sold out in 6 weeks. So they printed a 1-year supply, but a real stab at a 1-year supply. Sold out in a week. So Peter Atkinson went to Richard and said, we need an expansion fast. So Richard very quickly made Arabian Nights. But Richard went and talked to all his playtesters and had them, specifically the East Coast playtesters, but the other ones as well. And he goes, we need an expansion fast. So stop making Ice Age, which is what they were working on, and they started making Antiquities, which they did very quickly. So it's the first set to have a mechanical theme. The set has a lot of artifacts, a lot of cards that care about artifacts. And in fact, out of the 85 cards, these are the only 3 without the word artifact or artifacts appearing somewhere on the card. And I didn't even count Artificer, because there were Artificers on that card. It was the first to have a storyline. It was not a complete storyline. Tempest did a much more exacting, complete storyline. But this did hint at a storyline. It had names. It had flavor text. It really talked about the idea that the flavor was you were archaeologists digging up artifacts of the past, antiquities, if you will, and you were learning about this great story. The Brothers' War, which has become one, if not the most classic story of Magic. We built a set around it. We had a saga dedicated to it. It's something that really has become a core Magic story. So that is why Antiquities is number 14. Number 13, War of the Spark from February 2022. I was the lead vision designer. Dave Humphries was the lead set designer. Okay, so one day Doug Beyer comes to me. He's in charge of the story, and he was the person who created the Nicol Bolas arc that War of the Spark's the end of. So he goes, he's describing the story to me. He goes, and then the Nicol Bolas arc ends as he brings his horde of zombie Eternals to the plane of Ravnica, where he has trapped almost every known planeswalker, and he's planning to steal their sparks to regain his former power in an epic planeswalker war. And I say, how many planeswalkers? He's like, all of them, or almost all of them. And I'm like, you know I get 3 planeswalkers. Obviously, for those that know how the story ended up, I had more than 3 planeswalkers. We had 36 planeswalkers, which required, so A, it was something really splashy in a way that we hadn't done. Like, once again, if you told me we normally have 3 planeswalkers, and I told you there's more than normal, you might not guess 36. But we really pulled the stops out. So obviously, this is the first set that had planeswalker static abilities. Now that's a staple. It's the first one with uncommon planeswalkers. First set with hybrid planeswalkers that also happen to be uncommon. It introduced the amass mechanic, which has gone on to be a very popular mechanic. And we use it in a lot of places, and you might see more amass coming down the pipeline. And it was the first what we call capstone event set. The second one was March of the Machine. The third one is Reality Fracture, that they won't let me say anything about, but it's really cool. So that is why number 13 is War of the Spark. Number 12, Dominaria from September 2013. I was the lead designer. Dave Humphries, again, was the lead set designer. Okay, so we were going back to Dominaria. Now, as I talked about earlier, one of our challenges was a lot of sets took place in Dominaria. And even the set that took place more after Dominaria, the one set that took place more that wasn't on Dominaria, was Wrath, and we put it on Dominaria. So like Dominaria, and then we even made more cards from Dominaria, so more sets. So we were going back to Dominaria, but the challenge was, how do we make Dominaria mean something? We wanted it to be like a modern set, not 8,000 themes. So we tackled the idea of history. And the idea, it's a world whose future is shaped by its past. But the question was, what does history mean? So the obvious answer is the graveyard, right? It's where your spells go when they die, your creatures go there, you know. It's where things go when they're no longer in the game. You know, it's the past of the game. But the problem was, the year before we had done Amonkhet, and Amonkhet had a major graveyard theme. The year after, we were planning to do Theros Beyond Death, and it had a major graveyard theme. So I was informed, no graveyard. Okay, how do we do history? Artifacts, those are magical items from the past. Legendary things, some of them like Nicol Bolas is old enough that he is the past. And we really wanted to do stories, but we weren't quite sure what that meant. So we asked ourselves, how do we do a story? And that was the big question for us. So in Future Sight, Matt Cavada, who is, you might know as an artist, he was on the creative team for a while. Now he does art for Universes Beyond. He pitched the idea of, why don't we have a planeswalker? Like, planeswalkers are so important to the story, we should have cards that are planeswalkers. And so the whole point of the Time Spiral block was to depower the planeswalkers so that we could have planeswalker cards. But the big question was, what should they do? So, for the I'm Actually people that saw I'm Actually earlier, here's my little picture. So I was messing around in Future Sight. The idea was that we were going to make 3 planeswalkers, green, blue, and black, I believe they were, and they were going to appear on the future shifted sheet in Future Sight. So like this new card type would show up, and you're like, what in the world is this? But time ran out. So they ended up actually going into Lorwyn, not into Future Sight. We did, by the way, Tarmogoyf in Future Sight does have reminder text that references planeswalkers being a thing. So we did tease planeswalkers, but we didn't get quite figured out. So one of the ideas we really liked is, OK, what if every turn the planeswalker does something? So turn 1, create a giant 3/3 beast. Garrick likes beasts. And it's pronounced Garrick, by the way. Turn 2, for every beast you have, make an additional beast. And then turn 3, all beasts get +3/+3 and trample. You could see it. There was a story. Garrick would summon and get more beasts, and then a mighty... Now, I should also mention, originally, you would then go back to 1 after you went to 3. On the 4th turn, you go back to 1. So the problem is, let's say your opponent in turn 1, you make a 3/3 beast, and then your opponent lightning bolts to the beast. Well, turn 2, you double all your beasts, but you don't have a beast, so nothing happens. And turn 3, all your beasts get +3/+3 and trample, but you have no beast, so nothing happens. So it was very anticlimactic, and it made Garrick feel pretty dumb. Like, what is he doing? You know, and so we decided to completely change what we were doing. We ended up doing the system you guys know as the Planeswalkers. Okay, flashback, we're trying to figure out how to do a story. And I thought back to this, and I said, you know, the Planeswalker didn't have agency, so it didn't make sense for Planeswalkers. But you know what goes in a certain order? It always goes in that order no matter what? A story. And that is how we got to sagas, was the idea of using the rejected Planeswalker structure as a means to tell stories. Sagas have obviously gone on to be a huge part of Magic. They originally started as something we did occasionally, and then more. They're still technically deciduous, but we do them a lot. And so history obviously became artifacts, legendary things, and sagas. So I wrote that on a card. OK, whenever you cast an artifact, a legendary thing, or a saga, draw a card. And nobody seemed to get it. So Bill Rose, who was my boss at the time, or the VP of design, I guess my boss's boss. So he goes, I don't get it. And he goes, what do those things have to do with one another? So I said, well, they're all connected to history. And he goes, yeah, no one seems to get that. Remove them from the set. So I'm like, no. It's the glue. This is the history set. It ties everything together. We need to have it. So Bill goes, OK, here's what I'll do. I'll give you 4 weeks. If no one gets it after 4 weeks, get new glue. So I spent 4 weeks trying to solve the problem. And I did a lot of different things. And finally, the solution to the problem was stop referring to the 3 things. Just call it what it was. OK, what are these things? They're historic things. Whenever you play a historic card, draw a card. And they're like, OK, I'll explain that in the reminder text. What is historic? I'll explain that. But once I gave a word to it, people got it. And luckily, Bill got it, and it stayed in the set. So historic came to be. Historic is what we refer to as batching, meaning we connect a couple different things, we give it one word, we use that one word in the rules text, and then just explain in the reminder text what that means. Obviously, those things have to be connected in a way that makes sense once you understand them, so you can remember them. But it really was huge technology. We've done a lot of things to make use of batching. We have more things in the future that make use of batching. It's become a really valuable tool. We also did this neat thing. So Champions of Kamigawa, we were trying to show off that legends mattered. So we made all the rare cards legends. Some people might know that because it became pretty popular for that. But it didn't communicate it very well. Because if you opened a pack, you might not have even opened a rare creature. And even if you did, OK, it was a legendary. I can open legendary creatures. Like, you had to open a lot of packs before you started figuring out the theme. So in this one, we came up with the idea of, well, what if we just put 1 card per pack? What could be a louder theme? Every pack has it. And it really became a very cohesive way, and a tool we use a lot now of, if we have a theme, we always ask ourselves, could we do a 1 card per pack? And when we can, we do. So that's number 12, Dominaria. Number 11, Theros, in September of 2013. Lead designer was me. Lead developer was Eric Lauer. OK, I had the idea for a really cool block. A lot of people liked the idea of prehistoric. So I said, OK, set 1 takes place in prehistoric times. There's dinosaurs and everything you'd expect in a prehistoric set. I know people liked medieval stuff. So set 2, same world, 4,000 years later, whatever, many, many years later. Now it's a medieval world. And then I know people like the future. So set 3 is 4,000 more years in the future. It's futuristic, the most futuristic set we've ever done. And that was my idea. Ethan Fleischer, by the way, not knowing I pitched this, pitched something very similar in The Great Designer Search 3. So this is Brady Domermuth. He was in charge of the creative team at the time. He goes, that's 3 worlds. That's not 1 world. We can build 1 world. So he says, I have a pitch. Set 1, imagine if you will, we go to ancient Egypt, our version of ancient Egypt. We had talked about doing it. Let's just do it. Set 2, stay with me, we stay in ancient Egypt. And set 3, you got it, more ancient Egypt. And he goes, maybe in the 3rd set, we visit a little bit of some god realm or something, but let's stay in one place. We can build that. Because at the time, the creative team was 4 people. We're much more equipped now to be able to do lots of worlds because we have a lot more than 4 people. He also at the time said, hey, maybe you want to do enchantments. So let's talk about how Devotion got in the set, because Devotion was a big part of the set. So Aaron Forsyth, on the very first set he ever worked on, so I don't know how people know this, Aaron wasn't hired to be in R&D. I actually helped get Aaron hired to run our website. That's what Aaron started at. And for 5th Dawn, I put Aaron on the design team so that Aaron could write an article about what it's like to be on the design team that he could post on the website. Now, he's also a good Magic player. I thought he'd be useful, but that's why I put him on the team. And he ended up making Scry. He made Sunbursts. He did so well, we moved him over to R&D, where obviously he rose up the ranks. He's not my boss. Okay, so he made a card called Little White Butterflies. And the idea was you revealed your hand and you made butterflies based on how many white mana symbols you had. And I said, that is such an amazing card. That's not a single card. That's a whole mechanic. We can't waste it here. We have to save it. So then, in Future Sight, we were doing Future Shifted. I made this a Future Shifted card called Phosphor and Feast, saying one day we will do this. We will count mana symbols. And then a year later in Eventide, we actually made Phosphor and Feast, and we made a new mechanic called Chroma. So Chroma, when I do these talks, I like to get individual pictures that represent how it went. So that's Chroma. For those who don't get it, it's a lead balloon. Chroma did badly. So when we were in Theros, we knew that we wanted to do gods. I mean, this is, it was a Greek mythology-inspired set. And listening to the idea of Brady's idea of enchantments, we said, well, what if the gods were enchantments? What if the gods and the product of the gods were enchantments? And that way, one of the challenges of doing an enchantment set is there's not enough enchantments. So if a lot of the creatures were enchantments, you get your ass fan of enchantments up. And somebody brought up the idea of what if we use Chroma to represent the people who cared about the gods. But we knew that it didn't work really well, so we knew it needed a makeover. So there were a bunch of problems with it. Number 1, Chroma needed a better name. Chroma is just Latin for color. It needed better flavor. Once again, Chroma is just Latin for color. It needed to be more focused. Chroma would look in the graveyard or look in your hand or the battlefield. It just, we wanted to let the players build around it, but if it didn't all do the same thing, they went in different decks. So we said, okay, we're going to give it a better name. We're going to focus it. It's only going to be on the battlefield. And Chroma became Devotion. Devotion went over a little better than Chroma. Much beloved by the fans. In fact, it's become, when we talk about remaking things or doing a makeover of a mechanic, it's like our go-to example. Obviously, it also had an enchantment theme. Before this set, we had a lot of artifact sets, but only one set that ever had an enchantment theme. And that set had a lot of broken artifacts in it, and the story was literally referred to as the artifact cycle. So people didn't get that it was an enchantment-themed block. So when we did it, we really pulled the stops out. Enchantments have gone on to be something we use in a lot more sets now. It's become a much bigger theme. It inspired us to make a brand new frame for enchantments, which is now the regular enchantment frame. The set introduced monstrosity, so the idea that you could pay a mana to temporarily upgrade creatures. This has become a huge thing for us. All sorts of mechanics follows in the footsteps of I can upgrade things. This set introduced heroic, the idea that as you target things, things matter. Now we don't always call it heroic, and we've sometimes upgraded how it works, but just the idea of caring about targeting has been something we go to again and again. So that is why number 11 is Theros. Number 10, Legends from June of 1994. Lead designer was Steve Connard. By the way, I could not find a picture of Steve Connard. My wife had to go find a scrapbook from our garage, and I had to take a picture of it because that's the only way we could find a picture of Steve Connard. He used to work at Wizards. In fact, I first met him because he used to run something called the Caravan Tours, where they travel around the country and go to local game stores and show off Magic. And they would invite local sort of Magic celebrities, and I was the puzzle guy at the time. So when they came to Los Angeles, I came. That's my name tag. The lead developer was Scaff Elias. Scaff had joined Wizards by that point. So Alpha, once again, remember, printed a year's supply, sold out in 6 weeks. Printed a year's supply, no really, sold out in a week. And Peter Atkinson had said to Richard, we need expansions. Okay, so Richard, like I said, made Arabian Nights. He talked to all his playtesters, and they made sets. Antiquities, Fallen Empires, Ice Age, Mirage, all made by those different teams. But Peter went to people he knew, and so Homelands and the Dark and Legends were made by friends of Peter's. So we're going to talk about Legends. So Steve Connard was one of the 5 people founded Wizards of the Coast. Most people know Peter Atkinson was one of those 5. Steve Connard was another one of the 5. And they found Wizards of the Coast. And he was also a Dungeon Dragon playtest buddy with Peter. So he wanted to make a Magic set, so Peter said, go and make a Magic set. And he was really, really inspired by Dungeon Dragon. So most of the set was items that they had played with in their decade-long Dungeon Dragons game turned into cards. I will leave this up for a little bit because these are actual cards as he turned them in. They are bonkers. I'll highlight one of them. I'm going to highlight Lord Victor. This is the actual text on the card. It's a legend, 5 blue, white, which, by the way, back in Alpha meant it cost 5, one of which had to be blue, one of which had to be white. So this is really 3 blue, white. Perfectly reverse any sorcery attack upon opponent. Instant tap. And so Scaff Elias was the developer, and he had to turn all these cards into actual Magic cards, which hats off to him. Legends had a lot of wonkiness to it, but there were 2 things that it did that really set the stage for modern Magic. First is it made gold cards. Obviously, Alpha had the 5 colors, but this was the first set that combined the colors. And obviously, gold cards have become a staple for Magic. It also made legendary creatures for the first time. Now, back then, if you were a creature, you had the creature-type legend. But if you were a land, you actually had a legendary super type. So legendary did exist as a super type, but at the time, creatures were legends. Legendary obviously became an ongoing thing that we've done a lot of. The set did Legendary Matters, which cared about Legendary for the very first time. And it made the Elder Dragon Highlanders, which were both gold and legendary. And there's a pretty straight direct line from the Elder Dragons to Commander, being that it literally was Elder Dragon Highlander. In fact, the very first version, I don't know if people know this, or maybe you do, you could only choose those 5. You had to play with one of those 5. That's the only thing you could choose. You had 5 choices for a Commander. It wasn't called Commander. But anyway, so without Legends, Commander just wouldn't be. It only made 2 things, but those 2 things were pretty important. So that's why it's number 10, Legends. Number 9, Odyssey. I led the set. Randy Buehler was the lead developer. So this set had a graveyard theme. Now, there were 2 sets before that had a graveyard theme. They were small sets. This is the first set that really did it in a major way, that made it draft archetypes, that really built it in a core element of how the set worked. It wasn't just a piece of another set. It was its own set. And graveyard themes have become so vital that most sets now, at least one of the archetypes has a graveyard component. Not every set, but most sets. We introduced Threshold. This was a Richard Garfield mechanic. The idea that, at a certain point, the cards turn on and become better. And that certain point was 7 cards in your graveyard. Threshold became so important to R&D that we actually call any mechanic that does this kind of thing a threshold mechanic. And there have been a whole bunch of them, just some. Ascend, Metalcraft, Delirium, Spell Mastery. The idea that, once you meet this, things turn on. And threshold mechanics have become a staple of Magic. The set also introduced Flashback. And Flashback is something, it's become deciduous. We use it all the time. It was my pick for the best mechanic when I walked through the top mechanics of all time. And it's just, we keep making mechanics that are inspired by it. Harmonize, Jumpstart, Unearth, Aftermath. It's just, there's a lot of ways, like Flashback is just so useful. Also something we did on Flashback is this little thing in the upper left-hand corner. You might see it there. This was a tombstone icon. So the idea was it would represent when your card worked in the graveyard. So if your card worked in the graveyard, like it had Flashback, it would be there. And the plan was that we were going to do that on all the cards. But then something happened. We changed the frame, and it turned out it didn't fit on the frame. So we ended up making just an Odyssey thing. It was the original plan to be for all cards, and we occasionally do talk about it. It is something we bring back. Odyssey also had one other really important thing. It was the direct inspiration for Innistrad. But that's the story for later. Okay, number 9, Odyssey. Number 8, Zendikar. I was the lead designer. Henry Stern was the lead developer. So Randy Buehler was my boss at the time. This is before Aaron became my boss. And we used to sit down, and this is before arc planning. I would pitch what was called the 5-year plan. And then Randy had to sign off on the 5-year plan. And one of my ideas, I was enamored by the idea of land mechanics. There are a lot of cool things you could do with lands. There are a lot of cool lands. I wanted to make a set built around lands. And Randy said, okay, and he put it last. He's like, well, I'm going to need a few years to warm people up to this idea. And in fact, when I started the design, Bill said, I'll give you 2 months. Bill gave me a lot of time limits. At that time, if I'm not satisfied with the theme, we're going to go with a different theme. So in 2 months, we designed 46 different land mechanics. One of them was landfall. And in fact, obviously, landfall is the one we chose. And when I played it with Bill, he liked it so much, he literally played one game and said, okay, we're good. So landfall is going on to become a staple. It was one of my top mechanics when I talked about the top mechanics. And it went over like gangbusters. People loved it. And it taught us a really important lesson. There's a time and place for tension in game design where you make people have to choose between things. But sometimes it's okay to just reward people for doing things they already want to do. That's not bad game design. In fact, shocker, it is good game design. It makes people happy. People have fun doing that. And even then, if you say every time you play a land something happens, there are fun strategic decisions. Sometimes I will not play a land so I can save it for future turns. We did a lot of land-focused designs that set a lot of the future for that. And this is the first set that had 4 lands in a non-unset, which was a big deal at the time. Also, it's the first set that had an adventure world that really took us down that path. Obviously, it would inspire sort of the D&D set years later. And it had a singular typal theme. What I mean is, there was one type, allies, that we cared about. It was a big part of the set. It wasn't a typal set, but we had one card we cared about. And the idea of a singular typal theme has become so popular, most sets usually have at least one typal theme, because it doesn't need to be a giant theme. From time to time, we do larger themes. Lorwyn Eclipse will be one, for example. But we don't always need to do that. We can do just a small amount. So that is why number 8 is Zendikar. Number 7 is Future Sight. So I was the lead designer. Mike Turing was the lead developer. So if you remember, this was the past, present, future set. That was the theme. And the idea was the past would show you cards from the past that we in old frames. The alternate present would show you cards that you knew, but in different colors than you knew it. This was Wrath of God, but what if Wrath of God was a black card and it had a special what if frame? And then we had future shifted shames, cards from the future. Okay, so the players spoke to me and they're like, I don't get it. And I would say, it's cards from the future. And they're like, what does that mean? Well, you're seeing cards that one day might exist. And they're like, but they're in the set. They exist now. And I go, you know what a reprint is? Yes. They're cards from the past that show up in a set. Same thing, except these cards are from the future. Ooh. And they go, but they're in the set. And one day you'll reprint them. No. One day we might reprint them. and they're like, I don't get it. So, but we did a lot of future shifted cards. The future shifted cards did a lot of things. It inspired a lot of mechanics, contraptions, delve, poisonous chroma. A lot of them became out of it. Some of them we changed the name, obviously, along the way, but it inspired a lot of mechanics. There are a lot of individual cards that we just later would print. It's one of the fun things you do now whenever you start a set. Go look at the future shifter cards that no one's used yet and see if you can fit it in. It gets harder over time, though. And this also was a set that introduced Reach, Death Touch, Lifelink, Shroud. It had Tarmogoyf, as I mentioned earlier, that mentioned Planeswalker and Tribal for the first time. Obviously, some of these, Shroud would become Hexproof, Tribal would become Kindred, but all this got introduced in Future Sight. And there were cards that hinted at all sorts of things from the future. Sarcomite Mirror was hinting that Phyrexia was going to overtake Mirrodin. Who got that? That's why it's a mirror that's Phyrexianized. The Fomori showed up for the first time. Morgana showed up for the first time. But I want to talk about this card. This card is the one that most interests me. This is Ghostfire. So first off, it had a mechanic on it that would lead to a mechanic. This is the void that we would do later. It mentions Ugin for the first time. Oh, and I just learned this weekend, Matt Cavada wrote this flavor text. Ugin didn't exist at the time. Matt just made it up. It just sounded cool. And obviously a whole character would come out of that. And it mentions the Eye of Ugin, which once again, it just sounded cool to Matt. That would lead to the Eldrazi. Like, this one card, the amount of future space from this one card was amazing. And that's just one card. We also did something we call mix and match, which means we used two different mechanics. I had first done this in the Invitational on some cards I made. And the idea was, let's take mechanics from two different blocks and put them together. That has become a staple. We do mix and match in more sets now, especially with cameos. We also do what we call decadent design, which leaning into really flavorful nostalgia design. That inspired basically Modern Horizons. We pitched Modern Horizons as Future Sight 2, or Time Spiral 2 and Future Sight 2. And it had a lot of mix and match. That's something that's become a staple in Modern Horizon sets. Also, this set was pushing a lot of boundaries. Negative numbers, non-creature tokens, colored artifacts, enchantment creatures. None of that had existed yet. It also led to us making the Planeswalkers. As I said earlier, they showed up in Lorwyn, but we really started making them in Future Sight. So that is why number 7 is Future Sight. Number 6, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So I was the lead vision designer. Dave Humphreys was the lead set designer. So back in 2004, Champions of Kamigawa came out. It was right after the Urza block. Here's my summation of Urza block in a picture. The head designer at the time, Bill, I hadn't become head designer yet. I would become head designer in the middle of this block. So Ravnica was my first block. So he decided we should do a top-down block. Arabian Nights and Portal Three Kingdoms had played in this space, but we'd never done a whole block based on it. And so what he said is, it's going to be one of three things: Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, or Japanese mythology. Obviously, we ended up choosing Japanese mythology. The other two we would do later. But the problem was, Champions of Kamigawa block didn't do really well in market research. In fact, it's the worst testing set and world that we've ever done since modern testing existed. The sales weren't good. Online metrics that we measured weren't good. So it became kind of toxic. But time went by. Japanese pop culture became really popular. So we came up with this idea of, what if we do a world not based on Japanese mythology, but on Japanese pop culture? And Kamigawa was kind of, no one wanted to do Kamigawa. But I have a little Tumblr blog, some of you might read. And the #1 request on my Tumblr blog was, please return to Kamigawa. So when we started, what I said to everybody is, let's not decide where this takes place. Here's what we should do. Let's just build the world, and then we'll see whether it's supposed to be Kamigawa or not. But in my head, I remember my Tumblr blog. So I'm going to take a sip of drink here, I'm coughing. I remember my Tumblr blog, and I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make Kamigawa 2.0. So we built a design which ended up being tradition versus modernity, where half the set was Kamigawa, Champions Kamigawa, and half the set could be new stuff. So we baked it in so it had to be Kamigawa. And much celebration happened. The set went over really, really well. It showed us that we can reshape the past. That's the most important thing about the set. Everybody had written Kamigawa off. Nobody wanted to do Kamigawa. When I would point out that my blog wanted us to do Kamigawa, I would get laughed at. They're like, we're not doing Kamigawa. It showed that we can mix old and new, that we could have sets that really have nostalgia in them, but that doesn't mean we can't do new things as well. It used 2 game components as a spectrum. It had both enchantments representing tradition and artifacts representing modernity. It also dialed up the creatureness of equipments and sagas. We had sagas that turned into creatures. We had a mechanic that turned equipment into creatures. And it had very ambitious planeswalker designs. And I did an article about the state of design where I talked about the 7 states of design. This is the start of the 7 stages of design. It was so important that I thought like it changed the direction of how we design sets. So that is why it's number 6. Number 5 is Mirage. So the lead designer was Bill Rose. Lead developer also Bill Rose. So Richard Garfield, I talked about how when he first made Alpha, he had a bunch of playtest people. Some of them, well, one of them was Barry Reich, who was his next-door neighbor. One was East Coast playtesters I talked about before. And one was the Bridge Club. These were people Richard met playing bridge. So when he was working with the playtest, he goes, we're going to need expansions one day. So Barry Reich made what's called Spectral Chaos. Elements of it went into Invasion. The domain mechanic, which we refer to as the Barry mechanic. Like, you ever wonder who's Barry's land? Who's Barry? Barry Reich, he's Barry. The East Coast playtesters obviously made Ice Age. That became, shocker, Ice Age. And then the Bridge, they also made Antiquities, Fallen Empires, and Alliances. And the Bridge Club made a set called Menagerie. And Menagerie became Mirage and Visions. So Bill was really into Stratomatic baseball. And one of the things you could do is you could draft it. So Bill really liked drafting it. So Bill was into drafting. So one of the things that he was interested in when he was a playtester is he was one of the people that did the earliest drafting. The very first, I think, was Rochester was the earliest drafting. A booster draft took a while. So he was really interested in making draft work. So here's a little history lesson. How many common creatures does white have in Alpha? 4, one of which is more than 1 power. How many, in Legends, how many common red creatures were capable of dealing damage to an opponent? 1. Okay, in Ice Age, how many common creatures capable of attacking can fly in all of Ice Age, in common? 3. There was 1 normal creature, which was a 1/1. There was a creature with cumulative upkeep. And there was a creature that if you activated it and gave it flying, it died at end of turn. That was it. That was the common flyers. And if you ever play Ice Age Sealed, and I prayed you don't, the correct answer is if you ever open Illusionary Forces, play blue, and do not cast this card until you have enough mana that you can kill them, and you can pay all the cumulative up and kill them. So this was the first set designed to support limited. It had a more common removal, more evasion, larger creatures, and just more strategic decisions, things that made sense in limited. In fact, at Pro Tour Atlanta was the Pro Tour in Atlanta. It was the one where you played Mirage. Like, you opened up Mirage, had never seen it before, and you made decks. And I remember walking around, hearing everybody going how great their deck was. And the reason was the last thing they played was Ice Age. All of these decks were better than Ice Age decks. So this was also the start of blocks. We would take mechanics and run them through blocks, flanking and phasing. So that's why Mirage is number 5. Number 4, Khans of Tarkir. I was lead designer. Lead developer was Eric Lauer. This was the set where we did the structural large sets, most of the large set, but the large sets weren't drafted together. We had a time travel theme, original timeline, new timeline. You guys know this. And Sarkin goes back in time, And this was inspired by Karaha Foothills. I'm running a little late, which is why I'm speeding up a little bit. So when we made the set, we made 4 factions. 2 of them were 2-color, 3 of them were 3-color. And then the creative team said, oh, wait, we have 1 more. But the problem I said is, well, we can't do 5. If we do 5, it's got to care about, we can't ignore the mana if we do 5. So we ended up making Wedge. We had never done Wedge before. Alara had done Shards, and we said, okay, let's do Wedge. So we made it the Wedge set. And in fact, I used the same structure. I moved it for original Ixalan. So we saved it, and that's what original Ixalan used. This is the first set that had a 3-color structure that was really defined. Alara was the first set with 3 colors, but it was very messy. This set really understood how it was structured, and so much so that every 3-color set after it literally starts by taking that as its skeleton. So New Capenna, Tarkir, both mapped on top of that set. It had 3-color mana support, something that Shards of Alara did not have. It established new guidelines, for example, the Morph rule, that says if you defeat a 2/2, you must cost 5. So anyway, Khans of Tarkir is number 4. One other point, Eric Lauer just retired. When I asked him what's the best set he ever worked on, he said Khans of Tarkir. Okay, number 3, Invasion. Lead designer Bill Rose, lead developer Henry Stern. So back in the day, we had what I call the pick 2 block design. You would pick 2 mechanics and use them for the whole block. Mirage was flanking and phasing, Tempest was buyback and shadow, Urza Cycle, cycling and echo, Brigade of Mass was, these were unnamed, but Rebel, Mercenary, and Spellshaper. So Bill had a great idea. What if we just had a theme that connected everything? Like flanking and buyback didn't have, flanking and phasing didn't have anything to do with each other. So Bill wanted to start with multicolor. He thought that was a really cool thing. And so he was inspired a little bit by Spectral Chaos, the set that Barry Reich had made. And so what we did is, there were 50 multicolor cards in Mirage, but then Bill turned down the tap. Only 16 in Tempest, 0 in Urza Saga, 0 in Mercadian Mask. He was setting us up. And then Bill, I, and a man named Mike Elliott went to my father's house in Lake Tahoe, and the first week we built the skeleton of the set. It has a cohesive block theme for the very first time. It's not just make more, but we saved something for the 3rd set. The 3rd set was the enemy color set. We'd never saved anything before. It's the first sort that had really true multicolor support. It needed more, but it was the first sort that really tried. It introduced Kicker, which I joke is the mechanic that we keep making again and again. Kicker is one of the most useful mechanics. So much so, I'm not sure whether we would have done Kicker as Kicker, but it's the first set that had a new frame. These were split cards. I'm not going to tell the split card story because I tell it all the time, but it was controversial. This is my little design. I used to call it hit and run. That was number 3, Invasion. So number 2, Innistrad. I was the lead designer. Eric Lauer was the lead developer. So Odyssey, when it came out, was all about the graveyard. I talked about it earlier. But it wasn't, it was about like pit fighting was the story. So Brady Dommermuth, once again, who was the head of the creative team, said, this is the wrong setting. A graveyard set wants to be Gothic horror. So I go, I will make that set. And I waited. I was patient. I was very patient. Very, 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 very patient. But eventually, there was an opportunity. The problem was Bill wasn't really, by the way, I don't want to make Bill the villain. Bill's job was to check things I did, and so Bill was to make me make better things. So Bill's the one that keeps seeming to stop me, but somebody's job, which was Bill, was to do that. So I said to him, what do you mean you're not sure? He goes, can Gothic horror support a whole block? And I'm like, yeah, it can. He goes, well, how about one set? So he recommended is we'd have a fall set that was big, a small set winter set in the same world, and then we'd have a large set at the end that was an Innistrad. That'd be a separate world. The Innistrad would be one set. What would these sets be? We didn't know. Could it be Innistrad? No, can't be Innistrad. So they held a contest, a wizard-wide contest. Mostly R&D entered, but anybody could enter. And then Brian Tinsman won it with a world based on pattern matching. You guys all remember Pattern Matching World. So that was going to be set 1 and 2 was Pattern Matching World that had won this contest. But then someone brought up that, you know, Halloween is in October. Is it weird that we're doing a Gothic horror set and not taking advantage of Halloween? So they swapped it. And then Bill came to me and goes, can we do 2 sets? I'm like, yeah, Bill, we can do 2 sets. And then Brady said, again, this is Brady's job, could we make this 1 world, please? I have 4 people. I can't do 2 worlds. So we ended up making Innistrad. Obviously, Avacyn escapes. It was a big shakeup, so we could do new mechanics, but we kept it Innistrad. It's the first set of sort of modern top-down design. I mean, Arabian Nights and Portal 3 Kingdoms and Kamigawa definitely did top-down design, but this really set the marker for how we do it. We started doing pop culture influences. We did creature-type factions, not in a way that was typal, meaning you had to do it, but in a lighter way, which became very popular. Like typal, the idea that you can opt into it, but you aren't forced to do it. And that has become very popular. We do a lot more like typal now. We also did Walking Corpse for the first time. And if I told you no card caused more arguments in R&D than the printing of this card, you might not believe me, but it is true. 2 mana for a 2/2 in black. What are you doing? Also, it's the first set that had draft archetypes. Eric Lauer built them out. There were 10 2-color draft archetypes. We didn't quite get a gold signpost yet. That would come later. But this was the first thing that had 10 color draft archetypes that were spelled out. 5 of them were typal. 5 of them were not. Also, it's the first thing to introduce alternate draft cards. Cards that, when you pick them early, send you down a whole different kind of draft. Something you can do once you're more experienced with the set. It introduced double-face cards that obviously have become super important. So that's why number 2 is Innistrad. OK, number 1, Ravnica City of Guilds. I was the lead designer. Brian Schneider was the lead developer. So this is the first set that had true color balance. What do I mean by that? A little history lesson. So I'm going to take white, blue, and white, black just as a sample of ally and enemy. So in Legends, white, blue had 7 cards. White, black had none. In Ice Age, white, blue had 5. White, black had none. In Mirage, white, blue had 7. White, black had 3. Tempest, 2 and 1. Invasion, 17 and 6. That's the whole block. And then Odyssey, 2 and 1. So the grand total of the time was 36 ally cards to 11 enemy cards. And it got worse than that. I'll use lands as my example. So in Alpha, the lands were the same. That's the last time that was true for a while. So we would make lands in Mirage, but only ally lands, no enemy lands. Invasion would get ally lands, but no enemy lands. Odyssey would get ally lands, but no enemy lands. Even Ice Age, which did have enemy lands, they came and played tapped. They were actively worse. And it wouldn't be till Apocalypse that we made actual pain lands in enemy colors. Tempest did have an enemy land, but again, it was a worse cycle. It came in tapped. So the idea at the time was, let's treat all the color pairs the same. It was a radical idea, but obviously it's become the staple of how we make Magic. That the idea of, we can have ally and enemy, but the game is more fun if all the combinations work. Having them be worse to communicate the flavor that they're enemies just didn't make good gameplay. This is the first set that really did factions in a major way. And that's become a staple. We now try to do a faction set most years, or at least every other year. Factions have just become a core of how we make sets. And sometimes color, sometimes animals, sometimes, I mean, we've done a lot of different things. This is the first set that introduced iconography. Now, watermarks first appeared in Unglued, but this is the first set that really used them in any strong way in a normal set. And iconography has become a major part of how we make Magic sets. Like I said, it's the first set to use watermarks outside of Unglued, and watermarks have become an important part to communicate factioning. Also, introduced 2-color gold frames. So I don't know if you know this, but in Legends, if you covered up, all gold cards looked the same. It gave you no hint of what the color was. And then Ice Age came along, same thing, gave you no hint at what the color was. In Invasion, I actually pitched a frame where the left half was one color and the right half was the other color to communicate. I didn't win that fight, and they ended up being gold. But eventually in Ravnica, we did pin lines for the first time. And what I mean by that is it communicates on the card what colors it is. Ravnica did that. Also, Ravnica introduced hybrid. Hybrid mana did not exist until Ravnica. And we use hybrid all the time now. In fact, its use is ramping up. We're using it a lot more at lower rarities for limited, as Spider-Man does. It's the first set with factionalized pre-release kits. The first set has Shockland. Shocklands, they occasionally now show up in worlds other than Ravnica. So that is why number 1 is Ravnica, City of Guilds. So for those that like to take a picture, this is the full list of the top 20 set. This will also be taped and be online. So if you have friends who want to see this, the video will be online to watch. So thank you all for coming to MagicCon. So one last thing I want to say. This is the final event today on the stage. But tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we have the amazing art of Spider-Man, which will be very fun. We have a whole bunch of artists coming up and talking all about how we brought Spider-Man to life visually, which is really interesting. So please check that out tomorrow. But anyway, thank you, everybody. This has been the 20 most influential expansions.